So, welcome to Beautiful Text. Spread your wing with Spannables. Hi, I'm Stacy Devino. I'm a mobile tech lead at a fintech company. We'll go into that later, but I hope that you guys have come here, even if you already somewhat know things about the subject. I think you'll be surprised by how much breadth and content there is around this particular area that you never find referenced on Stack Overflow, ironically enough. So, fancy. Prepare for the puns and the GIFs. Sorry, not sorry. You may be saying like, I'm preparing you right now because this is a presentation that has a group of material design, animations, and a little bit of MySpace circa 2003 mixed in with the amount of GIFs and really terrible 80s and 90s references. Nickelodeon kids, I think you're going to be pretty happy. So let's continue on. So kind of, again, throwing out the puns here, spanning the details. So Spannables, what are they? Why would I need to use them? And why don't I just use HTML, right? So, there's a lot of things. It's not necessarily that documented. Pretty much every coder has learned how to write actual HTML at some point. Why not just go to that? And then types. Editable, spannable string builder, spannable factories, and then I kind of call this priority but spanned. It's basically indicating at the end, and we'll show you what that means as part of this, just how you're referencing what part of a span you're using and how you're actually doing the insertion. So I just called it priority, right? So this is kind of the more general use case. If you've ever used Spannables or spans, you've probably used it for strings and only string content, pretty much typefaces, things that you would normally use a document for, right? So when we think of those objects, it's text appearance, typeface, bullet spans, strike-throughs, quotes. But then we come to the more generalized spans, things that can be used for a number of different objects, like replacement span, clickable span, relative size span. And then we get into the really fancy kind of text, like subscript and suggestion and superscript. So when you see, like x squared, you see the little 2 at the top, that's what we would call a superscript, right? So the extra little thing at the top, or the ST in first. So kind of the final area that we're going to go over is specialty. And I am just throwing in a few of these, but basically how to do certain things with language and locale span so that you don't have weird mixed references. Making pictures. How do I actually put in icons, things like that? Have you used Slack or a number of other messenger apps and they have the cool iconography that might just be for that one messenger app, or you see icons as part of a display in a line of text? That's what they're using. And then accessibility. So accessibility is going to be a continual problem. Just when you look at your content IDs on your regular text, it doesn't really help when you have multiple different objects in a single line or in a single reference or in a single view, right? And it also doesn't help somebody in being able to traverse it using text-to-speech. So yeah, I put in a lot of names of things up there, and you may just be going, oh my God, there are so many types of spans. That's not even close to half that I even referenced there. So I have made an Android encyclopedia of spans, and also watch for, in the next couple of weeks, an application to come out that actually shows you how to use each type of span. And yes, there are a number of them that there is 0 references on Stack Overflow, and no examples that I've ended up using in a few areas, but this one just gives you kind of one-line descriptions and then categories. It's just a Google Doc. It's a couple pages at size 10 font, and that's how many spans and spannable objects there are. And that's not even including their subclasses or anything else like that. So it can get quite crazy, and it's not very well organized on the Android documentation online. So if you tried to use that, good luck. You can't always find the references just because of the way that they order everything. But it's okay. We're putting it there, making the encyclopedia. It's going to go. So some examples. So when you actually look at, and I have a laser pointer, this is where some of that 2003 comes in. When you actually look at some of what is being used in the New York Times, where it's actually got these little bullet points, and if you ever notice, it renders really, really quickly, right? And then here, where you see that there's bold, multiple colors, different sizes in the same line. And then here where you have URLs, or down here where you have clickable objects, all inside of a single line that take you and redirect you to multiple places. There is a ton of Spannables that have to be done here. There's really no other way to do it. And then also Google Docs. This is like the ultimate Spannables. They do some other things with Canvas. Josh over there, Joshua had an awesome presentation going over how to do some of that. But you can see that there's strike-throughs, multiple colors, fonts, different text styles. There's icons, and it's fairly complicated. And if you've ever had a designer show you something like this that you wanted and you did not know Spannables because you hadn't been to this talk, you would say, that's impossible, right? You're just going like, they must have made a million custom views. They must have literally drawn this by hand or got out a chisel and hammered out granite. But I'm here to tell you, as much as it seems like it's a pain and all these other things, it's actually quite simple, and you shouldn't have to worry about that. So, but why? Why do I need it, right? You can have multiple objects in a single line. Just like what we were showing in the Twitter example up there, you can have clickable objects, URL objects. You can have things that can be traversed via text-to-speech. Twitter and the Uber apps are fantastic at that. But it's also nice because you can keep it all together and just one object that can be set programmatically. It renders quickly. It renders fast. In fact, much more so than a lot of larger HTML.toText. And it also means that because you aren't having to put a lot of other stuff in there like markup language, oh my God, less data that you actually need to pull, and you can actually put your data together in a better way without having to add weird strings and references to perhaps an object that you got back via JSON, right? And like I referenced earlier, more programmatic control, simpler XML layouts. When I say programmatic control, I mean that this is something that you can put inside of a custom view, put your own constructors around it. It's highly reusable, whereas you may have layouts that have certain small objects that you can't really do an include on without it having some other weird reference, and you have to instantiate that. That's a lot of work. If you can build an object once, reuse it many times. Perfect scaling. You get perfect scaling on every device. So if they have a big, the Nexus 9 is notorious for being able to check all of your layouts and check your text and all that things. You can have it auto go over, multi-line, all that stuff. You don't have to worry about some of the scaling not being right, brand names not appearing like they are intended to, and weird language issues, things like that. It's not a problem. And you can use embedded resources like fonts and pictures. So if you already have a font that's referenced in your application, you can use multiple fonts or even variants of the font that are already defined. So you don't have to, and you can't do that with a lot of the HTML stuff. So when I talk about better views, we are talking about, there you go. So simplifying your views. So if you look at this view to the right, over here, it takes 5 objects to make that view. Here I have one view object, a single view object. That means that I can just say that, okay, if I want this whole thing clickable, I can just make that one thing instead of having to put another container inside of another thing and another thing and another thing. And then also make an external drawable shape that I have to define, and it can be referenced from everywhere. That's a lot of work. And it can also make it so that your view hierarchy gets fairly complicated, and it can also cause problems down the road with some of your scaling, right? So sometimes it's the only way. And this is usually when people start to get away from using HTML and some of these more complicated view hierarchy layouts that they know so well, is when you have things like this. Oh my gosh, it needs to go all the way over here, and I need to have different colors, and they need to be italicized, and it's not really something that it's possible to do using traditional, just regular, text references. So on here, and it doesn't really show a great job on it, but you can see there's a little bit of the elevation shown. If I want to use just a regular material design object and actually have things be centered and not have to implement my custom version of it and re-implement a lot of things, this is the best way to do it. So if I wanted to have this totally centered, this element can change, this text can change, that button reference, I just have to make the one view. It's just one view. And that's really quite helpful. So, spannable types. Your base one is just literally spannable. And it's your base class, can contain mutable and immutable objects, supports all different types of spans. You can have a span that has no content in its constructor, which is kind of nice because if you're going to be reusing it and renaming things and moving things around, you probably don't want to have some sort of object that is based off of another object, right? Or if you do reassignments. And then editable. So it's dynamic, it's mutable, it's editable, lol. So you pretty much would use this in situations where you're going to be using like an edit text. And like I talked about earlier, some of those messenger applications where you're going to be adding in objects or even different fonts, potentially different languages in the same string without having to do a lot of involvement on that. And then also, it supports all span types, but be careful because you may end up using an immutable object and you still want to keep it editable. You just need to kind of watch. And then usually there's a reference at the top of the span, just like as listed in the Spannopedia, that tells you whether or not the object is mutable or immutable when you go to the page. And then Spannable Factory. This is where you would actually make kind of spannable strings, and that's why I put Spannable String and Spannable String Builder in there. Basically, you have constructors, you have objects. It's how you kind of just do your one-line build of a new spannable object. So here's the simple one, right? The easy E of strings. Boom, easy as that. If I just want to make an object be what I showed you earlier, where I just bolded it, I italicized it, this is all I have to do. I need to give it a string that I put up here. You can also reference it down here, but there's only so much space, right? So I want to bold this text, and this could be something that you sent it in as part of the constructor, but basically I declare a new style span in there, and I just give it that I want it to give it the typeface of bold and italic, right? And it's just going to inherit whatever other objects are part of that text view already. And I just say, okay, take this content and set the span starting at whenever this simple starts, which is at the beginning, so that'll be 0, and then going from that till the end. So it literally just says, oh, okay, I end after the E. And this is where I talk about those spanned objects where you set the priority, right? Spannable, exclusive, exclusive. I just want this, right? And I'm referencing these numbers. And yeah, it's super simple. Did that seem like it was super hard to anybody? No? No? Yeah? It's like, this is the thing that I would love them to just even have this one reference as like what's right under Spannable, but unfortunately, developer.android has not gotten there yet. So yeah, it's super simple. And so we're going to build on this going forward to show you some more complicated things. This is probably the reference that you'll use the most often. It's the thing that comes up the most often. And believe it or not, even with this, you are actually using a lot less space and a lot less lines of code than you would if you did it via the view hierarchy model. So fancy text spans. So this is where we hit the situation where there's literally only one way to do this, and it is using spannable objects. So if we take our first input and we continue to this new output, we want to give this a strike through, right? So, oh, but I also want to make it purple. So in the same example, what we do here is we just hand it this strike through span. Now you want to check in the reference whatever constructor object it might need. Sometimes it doesn't need anything. Like in strike through span, I set it the same way that I did before. And then here, I use foreground color span. You can also use object just to set just the text color via some of the style spans and text appearance spans. But here I want to make that little strike through also purple, so I just say foreground color span, just make it purple, and just set it through. It's really quite simple. All spans and spannable objects are pretty much referenced in this way when we talk about setting them. There's really not that much most of the time that goes into what I need to send it for this span right here. There's not that much in the constructor, so it's usually pretty easy, and they all come through the same way. Boom. So clicky action spans. This is your clickbait. When we saw those Twitter references at the beginning where it actually says like at Queen Code Monkey, she was just up here prior to me. That's when. And we want to make this clicky. But you know what else I want to do? I want to make it blue to signify that it's a clicky object. You can also use a URL span to put that in there, but maybe it's not hitting a URL. Maybe it's just referencing another part of the app like it is in the Twitter app, right? So you could do this as two separate spans, but there is a quicker way to do this as part of your clickable span. So just like any other click object, you have your onClick. You can give it some kind of clickable action. So in this case, I'm just going to start another activity based off of you clicking that, kind of, again, pointing to the object reference that we had with Twitter. But what else I get here is I can update the draw state. So as part of what I actually put in there, I just say clickable span, and I don't need to put anything in the constructor. But I can say that I want the text to be underlined, and I can set the color. So that's a one-liner. Instead of having to make multiple spans and multiple span objects, you can just make it in a single piece, right? So we've made all that clicky, we made it do a bunch of stuff, but now I'm getting into the really fancy objects, right? So yesterday, if you went to Joshua's talk, he talked about using spannables inside of a canvas. And in this case, we're talking about using canvases inside of spannables as part of what's actually generated here. So there is a lot of text here, but the things to basically remember is I'm trying to make this object right here. Granted, I added this little elevation so it would stand out a little bit, but that's not really what we're doing. But important thing to remember here, Canvas skills. They are always useful. There is always going to be a scenario where this comes up at some point. It's not going to be every day. It's not going to be your daily job, more than likely. But they are always useful. So just like Bob Ross, believe that you can do it. It's a lot more simple than it seems. Just like when Bob Ross starts out with his very beautiful canvas that you see the end product of the first time that you encounter him, he's magical, right? And then he's like, 40 minutes into this, you can have the same exact canvas. And that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to give you guys the strokes to make really awesome, happy trees, right? So what we can use a lot of the times to do this, and when we talk about background images as well, is use replacement span. It's got a canvas as part of it already there, right? Everything's going to have some kind of draw. And it also has characters. So if I'm making something where I don't want to have it do weird overlays, and I'm not doing a bunch of overdraw, this is it. I just put in a context just because, hey, you know, I have some radius, I have some text color. Here, I'm actually declaring that I want that color to be white and the background to be red. You can also, again, make it a custom constructor so that you could make that object be whatever you wanted it to be. But here, I'm actually just making my own canvas where I'm saying, okay, rectangle, very simple. I'm setting it to that red color. I'm just drawing that rectangle that I declared up here, and I'm giving it a corner radius because there's really no way to do like a highlight background or just a text highlight and have it do this nice little rounded corner edge. Or even if you wanted to do this material background where you wanted to put a shadow box, you need to declare it in a canvas. So then I just get size, return that rounded math measure, and set it out. And so that way it's always in line, it's always the same size as the rest of the text inside of the Spannable object, and I can reference it as part of the line. So even though there's only this right here, I can put that in line with the other Spannable object that I showed you earlier, and it would not exceed the space. It would actually only hold the same amount of space as the other text objects. So, all right, we've done some fancy stuff with our spans. And we've seen some things that we can do with getting images behind, doing draws, doing different colors, clicky. I wanted to only touch on Locale Span because there are literally no examples or references of how to use this on Stack Overflow, and even that like Java doc that they have on the Android developer site doesn't really cover this. But when you're talking about a kind of a usual way, right, you might do a string format. I want to give it the locale US, and I want to say force locale string, right? But that's not so useful when I maybe want to have multiple language support, or if I want to have, say, a brand name. The user wants to have the application show them things in Spanish. But their brand name for this particular thing that you're selling, say you have a retail app, they are in the US. They want their locale to be the US. You don't want to use a different locale in order to get that language file in, but you do want to declare that, hey, this brand name, it only appears in English because they are in the US. It's very simple. You reference it just like you would any other span. And again, there's no examples, but here you go. So, pictures. Adding a bitmap or drawable or icon, they pretty much all show up the same way in terms of the Spannable object. So here I'm just going to get my Yao happy face. I'm going to set the bounds to be the same as what this text is. So if you think about the padding for the text, it actually goes out pretty far. And then here I'm just going to add my Yao face, and it's the same size as the text next to it. And just declare that image span to actually align with the same baseline as the text. And super easy object, no complicated fuss. I know it doesn't, nothing seems as complicated as it looks like, and as the documentation shows, but the implementation is actually very, very simple. All right, so let's play with color a little bit. So blurring text, blurring things out of focus. You can actually blur certain things to kind of animate an object or animate a span, so that if you wanted to have it be like where it tells a story or it gets somebody through a piece of text, you can use this. So you can use any mask filter. Now there are multiple types: background, foreground, surround. I showed you a little bit of foreground color earlier, or mask. And I just declare a mask up here. I say that I want it to be reasonably blurry, and it's kind of the normal type of blur. And then I just declare it as such. You can use any type of mask. Yeah, I wish I could tell you that this stuff was more complicated. It's just that it's not very well documented. It's actually very stupid simple. So accessibility. Accessibility is a major problem when you start talking about doing spans and doing multiple objects, because content IDs, as I referenced earlier, are not going to be accurate, right? Because you can have, say, a phone number that's in there, or a URL link, or you can have something where there's an action associated with it, but because you gave it like a clicky span or a URL span, that means that it doesn't have a content ID set with it automatically, right? So what I want to do here is, first, I'm basically saying, I think I have a phone number string in here, and while it's not something that is going to be immediately obvious as part of what you actually see on the page, you can declare this on top of your spans. So if you already have a clicky span declared, you can declare another span on top of it, just like we did with the strike through and the foreground color span. So here, I'm just making a basic phone number and doing my phone number builder and making it so that this is something that is traversable, and when they're using the text-to-speech engine in order to use your application, it just moves it through. It's very helpful, especially if you do have contact services and things like that, working on bigger applications. For me personally, I work on banking. Accessibility is a consistent thing to think about, not just in content IDs, but being able to actually use the app through nothing else other than voice. Accessibility Scanner does a great job of noticing a number of things, but it doesn't catch all these references inside of spannable objects. So you need to actually declare this actively. Bonus points. Okay, so I'm really surprised that my computer loaded this and didn't crash, because yesterday it was complaining about memory errors with how many animations I put in this thing. But bonus points, things that you can do using some of the tools that we went through here in order to kind of go forward and make something even cooler and amazing and make people go, oh my God, that was actually impossible. So you can use Span Watcher. So Span Watcher, especially for your editable objects, basically just tells you whether or not a span has changed, it's been removed, added, so that you can do different animations or actions based off of that movement. It happens more for editables than it does for, you know, the standard immutable objects for kind of obvious reasons, but it can be really kind of cool. Now what you can also do is use that to animate spans or animate in new objects. So let's say they put in a reference to an emoticon. Instead of just putting it in straight, you can actually say, oh, I've watched that this span has changed. They have put in an emoticon, and I can animate that instead of just putting it in automatically as part of just consistently reading the view. I can actually look for a particular span. So when I talk about the many types of span, it's literally like 20 different things on this list for just span. So there's inclusive, exclusive, priority, like I'll have to bring up that list at some point. You should really look it up because it can make certain references quite easy. Now for me personally, I showed you guys exclusive, exclusive. Some people like inclusive, exclusive. It just changes the numbers that you put there or how you're actually referencing it. So playing with making many types of canvas backgrounds, getting fancy with some of your objects that you can put in the background, creating images to do so, or even referencing other objects or constructors that already return a canvas allows you to do really fancy backgrounds without adding to the view hierarchy and without adding extra views as part of that. And my homework to all of you, and I will know, because I do rip applications apart, which is why I know what was in those apps. There was a good class about that at 9 o'clock. Remove all of your HTML to text. I will know. I will know because it will render not as quickly as your images do on your on your actual page. There's no reason to use it. It's basically the lazy man's out. I understand it can be a lot easier for just when I'm making a bold reference, but there's really not a reason to have it. It uses a lot more computation than it should, and it does use more computation than spannable objects typically do. So just like with house, yeah, you do get points if you act like you care. And acting like you care is actually removing all of your HTML to text. So with that, it turned out perfect. So I want to say a special thanks to my employer, the conference, a number of the actual presenters within this conference and attendees who have put any kind of object on Stack Overflow about Spannables. Especially, I wanted to give a shout out to Lisa Ray, because without some of her guidance and reading through some of her presentations on things involving text, I don't think I would have gotten this in depth with Spannables. And honestly, I would have been lost on how to do some of the things that I was presented by a design guru. So yeah, and if you are looking for some of these slides, that is the actual slides, just bit.ly Spannable. Again, you can find more references later when I actually finish the application up on GitHub, but the document already exists. And it's being added to all the time. If you need to contact me, my stuff's over here. Stuff about me, if you want to talk about other stuff, like I restore pinball machines, and I have a lot of sneakers. But yeah, any questions, comments, concerns, things that seemed a little bit off or a little bit complicated? Yes, sir.
Hi, so in the example when you extended the replacement span to get access to that draw method so you can do whatever you want with that canvas, is that draw method exclusive to replacement span, or is that like a base span thing that everything has access to?
So replacement span always has it. Some spans are very dictated in terms of what they actually have, like typeface span or style span, right? Those are going to have specific things as part of their constructor, but replacement span has basically all the span type objects that you can reference as part of it, which is why it's kind of the best for doing that kind of work. You can also put, like, if you're doing like just regular text span but not style objects all the time, but you can declare and extend your own style objects and make, those actually do have an on-draw, I'm pretty sure actually, but there's some that do and some that don't, and some are a little bit harder to get to just because of all the implementations and extensions that they've done of other spannable objects. Like I said, it's 2 pages long. I'm trying to make it as good as I can. But does that help you in any way? Replacement span's kind of the standard, though, for drawing objects on canvas.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Anybody? Did anybody learn anything new that they didn't think that they would ever find very useful? Like pretty text. Oh, and here's another thing that I found was really cool and I had a lot of fun with. So you can actually make a lot of objects. So yesterday, Joshua, I'm referencing him a lot because he had a really good talk on Canvas. He showed how to build basically the Gmail list objects inside the adapter as a single Canvas object. You can actually do the same thing using nothing but Spannables and basically putting Granted, it's not efficient, at least not as efficient as doing so in a pure canvas object, but you can actually have miniature canvases where you're defining round objects or even pictures, things like that, and then the text as well. And you can use the Spannable objects for pure emoticon and picture use, and you can stack them on top of each other so that you can have essentially a grid layout that will automatically adjust its rows and columns based off of how wide or how big of a space that you have in your view, and it can actually automatically resize as they scroll and as objects move. So you can do that really simple using a one Spannable object instead of having to put in some kind of animated view listener, recycler view, and a grid layout and then resize it. You don't have to do that. You could just literally put it in as a Spannable object, which I thought was pretty cool. So I've had a lot of fun playing with these and doing all kinds of random stuff. The animation side gets a little bit complicated, like any other animations, but especially with the physics ones now. But you can use all those same objects on Spannables as well, which is really cool. So have you ever had this exciting of a talk about text? Yeah, text. Okay, any other questions, comments? All right, cool.